Well, hello, Life Groups. It is so good to be with you again. I really hope you had the opportunity to watch this weekend's message, and I hope it started to stir some thoughts in your mind and in your heart that you guys can then begin to discuss here together today. Just a really quick recap of what I talked about this weekend. We looked at the story in John 4 about the woman at the well. And as I mentioned in my message, this whole story revolves around the fact that Jesus was cutting through a ton of the cultural baggage and ton of the cultural expectations that would have been on him as a Jewish rabbi to interact with a woman who was a Samaritan, who was a woman in the first place, and who was clearly very isolated because of something in her life, whether that was because of her own choices or whether that was because of the things that this world had done to her. Either way, she was isolated, and Jesus looked at her and offered her life. Why? Because he saw her as a child of God, and he saw her with dignity. And what I pointed out in the message is that when she had that dignity, when she had that ability to see herself for who she really was, her immediate response was to become one of the first evangelists. She went right back into her village and said, "Hey, everybody, come check out this guy who told me everything I ever did." And you know what happens? The story begins with her walking to this well alone, and it ends with her walking back with the entire village surrounding her. My big idea was simply this: the path out of isolation begins with dignity. Begins with dignity. Now, there are two things that I was really hoping that we would consider as a way of applying this concept in our lives. Number one is the fact that we're the church. We have a responsibility to be the hands and feet of Jesus in our world. And as I talked about, it's a very isolated time. It's a very isolated time. And in fact, here's one thing I want you to talk about as a group. What is the world's isolation meant for you? What do you see? What do you experience when you think about the isolation of the world? It's a very isolated time. So as we think about how to respond to this message, we got to start, number one, with our own response to those who are isolated. Are we treating them with dignity? When we see someone that the world says we should ignore, or someone that we think, oh man, what a pity that they have to live that way, do we listen to what the world says about who they are and how they're living? Or do we look at them the way that God looks at them, as his children? Do we look at them as brothers and sisters who deserve love and deserve dignity? Because when we do that, that is the beginning of the journey out of isolation for that person, if we can offer them dignity. Now, we're going to talk the rest of this series about the next few steps along that journey. It's not just dignity. That's not enough. There's other steps, but that's the start. That's the start. So talk as a group a little bit about what this might look like. Who are the isolated people in your world? When you look out around you, who are they? They might be young adults. They might be elders. They might be people who are isolated because of coronavirus. There are all sorts of ways that people are isolated. So who are they, and how are you going to respond to them? That's the first thing. The second thing I talked about, and kind of the way I ended my message, was the fact that with an issue like this, we're also talking about ourselves here. Because like I said in the message, we are all, in many ways, very isolated. Not only by the virus, but we're isolated by some of our own choices, the way that our culture is wired. We're isolated because sometimes it's just easier to be alone than it is to have to engage with other people. And so when we think about that, I think this is not just a message for us as the church. I think this is also a message for us as individuals. I'm suggesting that as we are dealing with our own isolation, that we look at this story from the vantage point of the woman at the well. What do we need to hear from God about our own identity, about our own sense of dignity and purpose and value? So I want you to talk about that as a group as well. How have you felt isolated? How have you felt lonely? What has this pandemic done for you? Has it made it worse? Has it made this situation of loneliness even stronger? Talk about that. Go there with each other and be open and vulnerable. I promise it's worth it to go there. And as you think about that, as you talk about that, ask yourself, what is keeping me from believing who I really am, believing the dignity that I have? What is keeping me from believing that Jesus actually loves me and that I'm worthy of his attention and time and energy? Ask yourselves those questions. Be honest with one another. And I hope this is an opportunity for you as a group to remind each other that it's okay to hold your head high. If you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling isolated, there is a path out, and it begins with dignity, the dignity that Jesus gives us.